Madam President,
The Assistant Democratic Leader,
as consent, the quorum call be suspended.
without objection.
Madam President, this is a sad time for the Senate and our nation. With the passing of John McCain, our country lost a legend, and the Senate has lost a towering figure. I've lost a friend. America owes John McCain, his family, our gratitude and respect for his courage and sacrifice, and for the trials he endured to serve the nation that he loved. John came into this world with big shoes to fill. His father and grandfather were four-star admirals in the United States Navy. John McCain met and exceeded his family legacy. I first met him 35 years ago. In 1982, we were brand new freshman congressmen elected to the U.S. House. I spotted him on the other side of the floor in the Senate, and of course knew instantly who he was, and worked up the courage to go over and introduce myself. And then I asked him a favor. I said, John, would you consider doing a cable TV show that I could send back to my Central Illinois district? And he said, sure, I'd be glad to. And I thought, that's amazing. A Democratic congressman asking a new Republican congressman to help him back in his district, and John McCain said yes. It was the beginning of a friendship. That cable show wasn't shown beyond Central Illinois, but I still remember it and still thank John for his act of kindness. It was my first exposure to a unique style of communication that America would come to know as the Straight Talk Express. Sitting for that interview was a typically generous John McCain act for which I am still grateful. There's an old joke about an Irishman who walks past a brawl and says, "Is this a private fight or can anyone get into it?" I think that man's name may have been McCain. Everyone who knew or served with John for any period of time got crosswise with him. I can remember there, in the well of the Senate, John McCain walking up to me, getting within an inch of my face and chewing me out about some article that he'd read in the Chicago Tribune. He was so mad he was about to explode. And he wheeled around and walked away, and I thought, what did I say? I can't even remember the article. So I raced back to look up the Chicago Tribune article he referred to, still couldn't understand his anger, and thought, how am I going to make amends with John? He's been my friend for so long. The next day he came up to me and I get ready for the second round. He puts his arm around me and says, oh, it wasn't that bad after all. We're still friends. Typical John McCain. A volcanic temper, but an embracing, loving approach when it came to friendship. That was John, passionate in his beliefs, not a man to hold grudges. He understood that two people can disagree on issues today, still both love this country, and work together tomorrow. Occasionally he would invite you on a trip. Be careful. I said yes several times. A John McCain trip over a weekend was something you don't soon forget. If there's anybody out there who thinks that senators with John McCain were sitting poolside drinking these mixed drinks with paper umbrellas, they've got it all wrong. John McCain's trips on the weekend were more like Bataan death marches. From the minute you got on that plane until you got back to Washington, it was a nonstop schedule. Everything had to be done, and we had to see 3 countries, not 2, and we had to get it done and get back to Washington. And you learned so much. I went to Ukraine with John, and I remember walking the streets of Kyiv in Ukraine, and people coming up to John who remembered that he showed up in the Maidan Square when the revolution was underway and spoke for those who were defying Moscow. They still remembered John McCain, and they couldn't wait to come up and say hello and thank him. It was that way in so many places in the world, and I was lucky to be there, lucky to be part of it, lucky to see history unfold, and lucky to count John as a friend. John and I had our disagreements. In fact, there was one solid year when we barely spoke. At the end of that year, I found an excuse to walk over to his office to see him on some issue. And I remember he stood up, he greeted me, he shook my hand, he looked me in the eye and said, I'm glad this is over between us. So was I. It was one of the happier days I served in the Senate. His ability to see beyond party labels was one of the qualities that so many of us loved and admired about him. It was a lesson he learned from his family, and it is a truth, I imagine, that he came to see even more clearly during the 5.5 torturous years, 2 of them in solitary confinement, that he spent as a prisoner of war in that hellish place known as the Hanoi Hilton. We are stronger together than we are divided, and John McCain knew that. His entire life was a testimony to that powerful truth. It is why, as a prisoner of war, John McCain refused offers of release, because he knew what the rules were. The rules were first in, first out. He was not the first in. He just happened to be the son of an admiral. And the North Vietnamese were going to make him a symbol and release him. He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't accept it. His body broken by the torture and the plane crash, he stayed in that cell and waited his turn until the moment came when he could leave with his head up. John didn't want to be defined as a professional prisoner of war. I love the story about a party that was given for John and his fellow captives after they got home. One young man was telling the story of his confinement in some detail when he happened to look over and see John McCain. He suddenly felt conspicuous and said to John, "I shouldn't be going on about my time as a prisoner of war. I was there for 6 weeks. You were there for 5.5 years." Typical John McCain humor and wit, John replied, "Oh no, go right ahead. The first 6 weeks were the toughest." Like Abraham Lincoln, John McCain knew that laughter helped to make the unbearable bearable. And like President Lincoln, he was secure enough in his own reputation and his own achievements to be modest. John endured the hell of the Hanoi Hilton more than many, and he served in the Senate longer than many. He leaves his mark on this body and our nation. When the issue of torture and detention was in front and center before the American people, when we were trying to decide what were the boundaries for this democracy faced with the threat of terrorism, there was one voice in the Senate who was credible. It was John McCain. I'd made speech after speech on the subject, but when John McCain got up and spoke about the issue of torture, there was silence on the floor of the Senate as we listened carefully. He proposed a resolution establishing humane standards of treatment, realizing that the humanity we showed toward our prisoners is the same humanity we expected if Americans were taken prisoner. And his effort was enacted by the Senate with over 90 votes, a strong bipartisan roll call. John McCain, more than anything, was a champion of the United States military, the men and women who serve in our armed forces. They never had a better friend. Our nation's veterans and their families never had a stronger ally. He was a leader in the fight to curb the influence of special interests in politics and to make our government truly a government of, by, and for the people. With Russ Feingold and John McCain, they moved us toward what America is longing for, putting the special interests behind us, putting the people first, ending soft money. He treasured our heritage as a nation of immigrants. I have such profound respect for John McCain's efforts to reach across the aisle to try to find solutions for America's broken immigration system, even as his own party railed against him. We spent almost a year together, 8 senators, 4 Democrats, and 4 Republicans, led by John McCain, to write a comprehensive immigration reform bill. It was one of my proudest moments in the Senate. It was why I ran for the Senate. It was what John McCain told us over and over was to be our mission in life as senators. Solve the problems facing America and don't be worried about taking some heat. He took a lot of heat as a Republican who stepped up and offered a real solution to our comprehensive immigration challenge. We put together a bill over the course of a year. I think it was an extraordinary effort. We all had to compromise. John compromised, I compromised, but we ended up with a bipartisan bill that passed overwhelmingly on the floor of the U.S. Senate. There hasn't been another moment like that in the time that I've been here, and John led the way. And he took a lot of grief for it. His poll numbers were not that good, particularly among the most conservative Republicans. But John knew we had a problem to solve, and he stepped out and did it, and I was just honored to be part of the small group that worked night after night, week after week, to put that effort together. Of course, what I remember now more than anything is that middle of the night vote a little over a year ago. He walked through that door, just having spoken on the telephone with President Trump. And he came to the well of the Senate, and he stood right next to that table, And because he had limited motion in his arm because of the plane crash and torture in Vietnam, he barely lifted his right arm and pushed his thumb down and said no. And with that no vote, he preserved health insurance for millions of Americans, and he invoked the ire of conservative Republicans who will never forgive him for that moment. It was one of the proudest, most courageous votes and moments in the history of the Senate. And I was honored to be here and to have a chance to thank him personally that night. I also remember when he came to the floor and spoke at that desk, which is now bearing the vase of roses, tribute to John McCain, and reminded all of us why we run for this office. Sure, it's a great title, and a lot of Americans never get close to a title like United States Senator, but to John McCain and to many of us, it's much, much more. It is not only a great honor, it is a great challenge for us to do something with this title, to solve the problems that face this country. I didn't always agree with John, but I always respected the fact that he wanted the Senate to be an institution which was serving the people of this country and solving the problems that we face. John was principled and courageous time and again. There were times when we had our differences. I can recall when he came to Illinois to campaign against me. He was campaigning on behalf of a state representative in Illinois named Jim Durkin, not Durbin, but Durkin, who had been John's supporter for president in the state of Illinois. John returned the favor by campaigning for Jim Durkin against me. Now, you might wonder in this world of politics how you react to a person who is trying to take your job away, which John was doing. Well, I understood it. And I expected it. Jim Durkin was loyal to John McCain. John McCain was loyal to him and came in and campaigned for him. After the election was over, the people of Illinois decided I should be the senator. It didn't deter John McCain one bit from working with me from that point forward. There's an empty space in this chamber without John McCain. There's an empty space in America without his spirit. He will be missed, but he certainly will never be forgotten. I endorse the proposal to rename the Russell Senate Office Building in honor of Lieutenant Commander and Senator John McCain. Like Senator Schumer, I hope that decades from now, children who are visitors to the Capitol grounds will ask, well, who was this McCain they named the building after? They will discover he was a man worthy of our respect, a man who is in his heart a public servant, a man who was an American hero. Madam President, I yield the floor.